and a 9%.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho. Joining me on set is Shaka Sali himself, aka the Kabale Kid. Hello, Shaka.
Hello, Paul.
How are you?
Usually terrific. You keep amazing me, Paul. I wouldn't mind really being a fly in your wardrobe. Because you seem to be having a factory of these incredibly gorgeous shirts.
I told you I was launching my own collection, the Indiho collection, so be my guest, my friend.
Well, one of these days we'll probably be talking about how the fact that you are having deep pockets doesn't really hurt you at all.
Well, I beg to differ on that point, as me particularly having deep pockets. But before we do that, let's greet our followers on Facebook. Welcome to Shaka Extra Time, a show that comes to you every Tuesday. Today we are talking about a wide range of issues. This week seems to be a tsunami of news happening on the African continent. But before we go to the news, maybe let's start with an update on the Africa Cup of Nations currently underway. It's day number 5. Of the Africa Cup of Nations in Egypt. So we've had Group A. It looks like Egypt and Uganda leading that with 3 points each. You have Group B, Nigeria leads. Algeria and Senegal lead Group C. And Group D, Ivory Coast and Morocco. Group E, Mali seems to be leading. These are all teams that have won their first matches. Your thoughts, Shaka?
What is interesting about that is that most of the teams you have mentioned are some of those that have actually been dominating the tournament. You're talking about groups from North Africa, groups from West Africa. But what is very rare here in that particular club is a country named Uganda. The last time I checked, from what I have seen, no team from East Africa has actually ended up winning it all. That honor has gone to North Africans, it has gone to West Africans, it has even gone to Southern Africans.
But Shaka, the jury, one could argue that the jury is still out there. These guys still have chances to play. This is the first tournament, so they still have a couple rounds. They haven't reached the elimination round as we speak.
It is very true, but if history is anything to go by, I remember when I was a very little kid, in Uganda on October 9th, 1962, when Uganda regained its political independence from Britain. Uganda invited who else? The Black Stars of Ghana to come and play at Nakivubo Stadium. I cannot believe what my eyes were looking at. You had this great team known as Black Stars of Ghana. They were not particularly very tall people. They were short and what have you. But boy,
those are the best
they
at soccer.
Incredibly gifted, incredibly talented. To be honest with you, Paul, any of those 12, 11 members of the team could have actually scored against Uganda. They scored to such an extent that sometimes they would actually take the ball to the Uganda goal and actually decide to take it back. Incredible. And you believe we are celebrating regaining our political independence from the British.
Amazing, amazing. You talked about the East African countries not maybe showing impressive scores this time around. But there is something remarkable, the fact that at least you have almost 3 countries, major countries. You have Uganda, you have Kenya, you have Tanzania, including Burundi, playing at the Africa Cup of Nations. By any measure or standard, this is a remarkable achievement for these African countries, because we haven't seen some of these East African countries playing at that level.
I think you're right. They should obviously be, they should be praised they should be given credit for at least making it to Cairo. There's no question about it. But having made it to Cairo, what are they going to show for it? They have to be able to show something. Come on, at least for regional pride. For regional pride. And
Uganda is representing that.
Yes, and I hope that they can go all the way.
Well, let's go to our regional news. Speaking of regional news, let's start in Ethiopia. Things seem to be unfolding in Ethiopia. As we speak, a couple generals, people connected to the Amhara region, including one of the generals, the Army Chief of Staff in the Ethiopian Army, was killed, apparently as a result of an attempted coup. Have you been able to establish what's going on?
It's probably not very much surprising, because you're talking about a government led by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, really coming with what looks like these huge social, economic, political reforms. And you know, like any change really, when you talk about change, Paul, you're not talking about an event. You're not talking about an incident. You're talking about a process. And when you talk about a process, you're looking at a process that obviously benefits some people and leaves out some other people.
Right.
And so what we are looking at is the kind of resistance that is reacting in a manner that is causing violence, causing a lot of problems and what have you. But at the end of the day, I think the leadership of Ethiopia, the people of Ethiopia will prevail.
What seems to be the problem? Abiy on the international stage is a liked guy. A lot of people think that he's the kind of miracle a lot of Ethiopians or that region has been waiting for. But on the ground, it seems that the story is a completely different thing, because Ethiopians themselves, when you talk to them, they seem to think that he's maybe rushing to make these dramatic changes. Therefore, he's become a target.
Yeah, but you know, when you look at the history of Ethiopia, for example, you will recall that it is perhaps the only nation on the African continent that has never experienced colonialism. It is the only country on that continent that was never ruled by European powers, except very briefly during the Second World War, when the Italians, you know, came to Addis Ababa to revenge their defeat at the Battle of Adwa. So when you think about a country like Ethiopia, which was an empire, being ruled by emperors and all that kind of stuff, a country, frankly, that has never experienced democracy. Abiy Ahmed is a symbol of democracy. He's a symbol of social change and the changes that are very necessary. But he has to figure out how to navigate his way through negotiations, through consultations. He also has to figure out how not to go as if, in fact, he is socially and politically sprinting. Because at the end of the day, the ball game is a marathon. It's a political marathon. And I think that, yes, you are right that he has a lot of followers and a lot of supporters from outside of Ethiopia. But I think equally, more importantly perhaps, he seems in fact to have a lot of Ethiopians supporting him on the ground. It is simply some of the Ethiopian political, military elite, those who are eating, as someone would have said, and those who feel that they are actually losing out. And yet, what is important and what should happen to Ethiopia sincerely is what Abiy Ahmed stands for, which is social, economic, political justice for all Ethiopians.
Shaka, you bring up a very good point. You talk about the political elite, the military. How about those people who argue that, for example, maybe you should do a purge, maybe try to clean up a house, because if you remember, this is a person who was, quote unquote, installed as a prime minister. So he doesn't have that that network of maybe soldiers who are indebted to him. So maybe perhaps you should do a purge and clean up the house.
He was installed, but in fact he came to power through what you would sincerely agree was a democratic process, because his name was chosen by members of parliament, a majority of the members of parliament, and especially the EPRDF, the ruling party. Mm-hmm. And they came because he comes from the Oromo community, which arguably forms the majority ethnic community in Ethiopia. And its young people, for years, were actually demonstrating, that they do not feel that they were part of the game, and what have you. And eventually, the political powers that be had to figure out a way how to respond to those voices. And that is how Abiy Ahmed came into the spotlight. But I think the good thing about him is, first of all, he's young, intelligent, and frankly, he seems to have very strong character and integrity. He seems to be a new breed of African leadership. I know that at one time you said that he probably wasn't that. He may have been acting the part like some of his counterparts and all that kind of stuff, because we have had this business of a new breed of African leaders before. But this was a description given to some of these individuals on the African continent by some people in the international community who, in a way, were like their masters. Because they went further, in fact, and said these were not only a new breed of African leaders, perhaps because they had read Shakespeare, Chaucer, Bernard Shaw, and what have you. And they even actually said that they were very likely, in fact, to be the beacons of hope for African democracy. We have not seen that in Asmara, where Isaias Afwerki stays in power. We had not seen that in Addis Ababa, where Meles Zenawi was the new kid on the block. We have not seen that in Uganda, a beautiful country, an incredibly beautiful country that you and I come from, where, of course, President Yoweri Museveni remains in power since 1986. We have not seen that in Rwanda, where you had a President Pasteur Bizimungu, who became president after the genocide, and later he was replaced by President Major General Paul Kagame, retired but certainly not tired. We have not seen into that. In fact, they went to the extent of saying that there could even be something like that happening in Kinshasa, Democratic Republic of Congo, especially under Laurent Désiré Kabila. It never actually happened. I remember I was in the region when the then U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright visited those countries that I've mentioned.
Yeah.
And was basically anointing them. In fact, I was on a state lounge, Kampala, courtesy of Amama Mbabazi, who was then very, very powerful and helped me to get into the press conference and what have you. I will never forget one day when Madeleine Albright, standing next to Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni, praised Yoweri Museveni and what have you, and said, "You are the beacon of hope for African democracy."
Shaka, if one was to rewrite that particular history that you talked about of the new breed of African leaders, would they, if I was to rewrite that history, I would pray not to use the word new breed of African leaders. I would use perhaps the word new dictators of African leadership. because all the leaders that you've talked about have, in a way, with the exception of Maris and Desele Kabila, who died, all the other leaders are still in port and they're still in charge of their countries. Would I be correct to say that they're perhaps not a new breed of African leaders, but a new generation of African dictators?
Well, you obviously, like a lot of other people, are entitled to your opinion. You probably would not be very wrong, except that perhaps you could amend it by saying a new breed of African dictators.
Let's go to a comment here. Going back to, you talked about young people rising up. We have a comment here from Ariel John Batt. Do you think pressure groups can cause change to the government, especially in light of these uprisings that we see taking shape on the continent?
Oh, there's no question that that can happen. We have seen it happen, in fact, more recently in the Sudan. You're talking about the Sudanese Professional Association, for example, which mobilized young people, professionals, and what have you. And guess what? Field Marshal Omar al-Bashir is no longer in State House, Khartoum. There is someone else. And that someone else should actually be very, very careful and listen to the democratic voices of his compatriots. Because recently they mobilized about 1 million people, Paul, who basically marched in Khartoum, the capital, essentially in solidarity with democracy. And it's going to happen. It may not happen now, but you cannot prevent it because, frankly, when it comes to the issue of justice, it is like a river flowing. You may delay it to reach where it is going, it may detour and what have you, but at the end of the day, it will arrive. And democracy will happen because it is an equal opportunity employer.
Let's maybe look at like the role of the African Union. A lot of people have, including myself here and other people, are critical of the role of the African Union, especially in light of what is happening on the continent, when it comes to supporting these long-time leaders. They are indifferent, or sometimes they just sit back. In some cases, they raise their voices or they try to suspend countries. But there are others who suggest that they're not doing enough. I can also tie that to a comment from Anthony Kutunga Matoka. How do we get the African Union to be proactive and move beyond that silent diplomacy?
It's very interesting. If you read that name correctly, I seem to remember someone by the name Anthony Kutenga Matoka. And you can't believe it, if he is from Zambia, Lusaka. Paul, he was one of my roommates.
Wow, interesting.
When I was an undergraduate student in upstate New York, more specifically at the State University of New York, Albany campus. He was a great roommate of mine, and we keep in touch. As a matter of fact, the last time you and I were in the Zambian capital, Lusaka, we had a drink with him at the Radisson with his brother. He's a former Zambian diplomat. So he should probably be in a position to answer some aspect of the question that you asked, why the African Union is a little bit more diplomatic than, you know, the kind of institution, frankly, that delivers the goodies. I think part of the problem is that when you look at its structure, what it was put in place for, it was put in place not necessarily really to serve the people of Africa, but rather to serve the people who hold those important positions in Africa to somehow stay in their positions. Because, to be honest with you, it is like talking about an individual who has the teeth, but not having the ability to use those teeth to actually bite. And that could happen, especially with the changing demographics. I have great belief and confidence in the young people of Africa to bring about changes. Because especially, first of all, they are very lucky in the sense that they are living in tandem with the social media, which gives them the kind of exposure, exposes them just like probably no any other generation before that. They are also more educated. They are more mobile. They have interacted more, much more than the generations that, for example, I reflect. They are people who are used to debates and are comfortable with agreeing to disagree with one another without necessarily rushing for the AK-47, hoping that they can actually solve anything.
Let's go to another follow-up. Let's go to one of your big fans here, Nambililwa Mwana Amina. Shaka, is tolerance possible in the era of following political trends on the African continent?
Tolerance?
Yeah, in terms of having a political dialogue where these leaders have refused to leave power and they can't even engage with the opposition, especially in what's happening in Sudan.
Tolerance is obviously an option that you never throw out. It is like humility. Some people, for example, mistake humility for weakness. On the contrary, humility is very, very powerful. And eventually, essentially, it prevails. It delivers the goodies and all that kind of stuff. I think what is lacking in Africa for the most part is the spirit, for example, of social, political consciousness. And how does that come about? It comes about through some sort of civic education. Governments have the power. They have the ability, for example, to bring about that. But for the most part, a lot of African governments do not invest in that kind of situation. Perhaps because the guys who are in leadership positions do not think that the outcome would be favorable to their keeping the positions that they hold right now. But I think for the ordinary people, the moment they realize the kind of power they have, then they can obviously mobilize. And once they mobilize, they can also organize. One of the greatest sons that Africa or the African soil has yet gifted us was a Ghanaian by the name, the Osajefo, the Redeemer, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, the kid from Nkroful. And I have had the opportunity to actually go to Nkroful and pay homage. It was a sort of pilgrimage. In fact, I went with his only daughter, Samia Nkrumah, who used to be a member of parliament. I went to Nkroful to pay homage, really a pilgrimage of sorts, just like the Muslims, for example, go to Mecca. For the reason that this man, when you think about it, I remember on March 6, 1957, when the then Gold Coast colony was regaining its political independence and became Ghana, reflecting one of the ancient, great African kingdoms. He challenged the people of Ghana and said the independence of Ghana would be meaningless unless it is linked with the total liberation of the rest of Africa. And he did not simply talk the talk for. He actually walked that talk by providing the necessary tools and support and what have you to other groups on the African continent which were struggling and fighting against European colonialism and imperialism later. And guess what? In 1994, with the independence of South Africa, the end of apartheid, with the Madiba himself, Nelson Mandela becoming president of the multiracial South African society, the dream, the political aspect of the dream of Kwame Nkrumah was realized. This is a man, in other words, who was selfless. This is a man who said he was not an African because he was born in Africa, but in fact, he was an African because, according to him, Africa was born in him. So he had this big dream, and he made sure that the dream was realized. And the young people can take the ball a little bit further and help to remove all these superficial, artificial boundaries that make Africa become 54 independent member nations of the African Union, plus Western Sahara, which still is disputed by Morocco, to be 55, to actually become a major power, because it has everything that one needs to be the most powerful society on this planet Earth.
Let me do a quick follow-up, maybe here with a comment. We visited this topic last week, but it seems to be coming back. The issue of having a doctorate, a PhD degree, whether it's a qualification in African politics. Let's go to a comment from Prince Mwamba. He says, is an academic doctorate a qualification in African politics, specifically the office of the president?
Well, I have to say that on the contrary, I don't think that one needs to have a doctorate of philosophy in order to qualify and become president of a country. The PhD is good in the sense that it is a major research degree. So it obviously helps you to access the necessary tools that you may need in order to analyze a situation so that you can get, resolutions or solutions and all that kind of stuff. What one needs really, first and foremost, is integrity. The other is character. And also to be socially, politically aware and conscious of who your people are, your society, its needs, and how to consult them before you make decisions that affect them.
Very briefly, talk about what's going on tomorrow on Straight Talk Africa.
Tomorrow it is very interesting because it is a very, very open topic in the sense that we are in fact looking at the politics of political transitions in Africa, especially where you do have some people who have lived and served their countries long. We're talking about a man like Theodore Obiang Basongo of Equatorial Guinea, who has been president since 1979. He basically treats his country like personal property, like a farm. One of his sons, in fact, is vice president. And
arguably one of the richest people on the planet.
And yet, he obviously does not work for that kind of riches, that kind of wealth. He simply takes away from the people. You have a country that is so rich that, in fact, when you think about the things that are important in life, they should just be rights, not...
Unfortunately, Shaka, I have to cut you off. We are running out of
rights,
time.
Rights, not privileges, but unfortunately, that hasn't changed. It must change.
We'll see that. Excuse me. Thank you so much for being a great guest. I'll see you on another edition of Shaka Institute Time. Thank you.
You're most welcome.